December 1944, a civilian woman stood before skeptical officers holding what looked like scrap metal and glass. They called it junk. She called it survival. Within weeks, her homemade compass would do something military-grade equipment couldn't: guide 73 American soldiers through the Ardennes forest while enemy patrols hunted them. What those officers didn't know, she had already tested it behind enemy lines, alone. December 3rd, 1944, 0430 hours, Bastogne, Belgium. Temperature 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of wet pine and diesel fuel hung thick over the American encampment as officers huddled around maps that might as well have been blank paper. The forests of the Ardennes had become a death trap, and standard military compasses were failing with terrifying consistency. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison slammed his fist on the wooden table, scattering reconnaissance reports across the cramped command tent. 17 patrols, he said, his voice raw from shouting orders through frozen air. 17 patrols sent out this month. Only 9 returned. The others? Lost, captured, or dead in those goddamn woods. The problem was mathematical and brutal. The Ardennes forest contained massive iron ore deposits that turned conventional magnetic compasses into spinning lyres. Add German jamming equipment, dense fog that lasted for days, and evergreen canopy so thick that celestial navigation became impossible, and you had a tactical nightmare. American forces needed to move supplies, evacuate wounded, coordinate flanking maneuvers, and establish communication lines through terrain that had become navigationally impossible. Statistics painted a grim picture. Between November 15th and December 1st, American forces in the region had lost approximately 340 men to navigation failures alone, not to enemy fire, but to getting lost. Patrols would enter the forest with coordinates and confidence, only to emerge miles from their intended destination, sometimes walking directly into German positions. Supply convoys vanished. Wounded soldiers died waiting for medics who couldn't find them. The 101st Airborne, tough as they were, had begun refusing certain routes entirely. "We're fighting two enemies," Major Robert Chen observed, studying a topographical map with increasing frustration. "The Germans we can predict. This forest, it's eating our men alive." Standard solutions had failed spectacularly. Military-issue lensatic compasses spun uselessly or pointed toward iron deposits instead of magnetic north. Engineers attempted to create shielded compasses using brass and copper housings, but the forest's magnetic anomalies penetrated every defense. Radio triangulation failed because German jamming created white noise across multiple frequencies. Even experienced scouts with decades of wilderness training admitted defeat. The Ardennes forest had characteristics unlike any American terrain. Into this desperate situation walked Margaret Hayes, 31 years old, a woman who shouldn't have been anywhere near a military command tent. She had grown up in rural Montana, daughter of a surveyor father who had taught her celestial navigation before she learned algebra. After Pearl Harbor, she had volunteered for the Red Cross, been stationed in London, and transferred to Belgium to coordinate civilian evacuations. She had no military rank, no engineering degree, no authority whatsoever. But she had spent 3 weeks trapped behind German lines after her convoy was ambushed, and she had navigated 18 miles through enemy territory using equipment she built from a destroyed vehicle's dashboard. "Ma'am, with respect, this is a military planning session," Lieutenant Morrison said when she entered the tent, escorted by a Red Cross coordinator who insisted he listen. Margaret placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside, nestled in cotton padding, sat what looked like salvaged junk, a circular brass housing no larger than a pocket watch, filled with mineral oil, containing a needle magnetized using techniques that predated modern manufacturing by centuries. The casing was carved from instrument-grade maple. The needle floated on a pivot point salvaged from a wristwatch. Calibration marks were hand-etched using a straight edge and infinite patience. Your compasses fail because they're trying to find magnetic north in terrain that has no consistent magnetic north, Margaret said, her Montana accent cutting through the officer's skepticism. This compass doesn't look for magnetic north. It finds true north using differential magnetic reading combined with gravitational settlement patterns specific to this region's geology. Silence filled the tent. Major Chen picked up the compass, turning it slowly. The needle moved with unusual fluidity, settling into position with mechanical confidence that military compasses lacked. How does it work? I can't explain the mathematics in 5 minutes, Margaret said, but I can tell you I used it to navigate from Houffalize to Bastogne, 18 miles through German patrols at night in fog, and arrived within 50 yards of my intended destination. Houffalize is 20 miles inside German lines, Morrison said slowly. You're telling us you walked through enemy territory alone? I'm telling you this compass works. Your men are dying because they trust equipment that can't function in these conditions. I can build more of these. I need materials, time, and someone willing to test it under real conditions. The skepticism in that tent was thick enough to cut. Officers exchanged glances that communicated everything. Civilian woman, no credentials, homemade equipment, impossible claims. One captain muttered something about Girl Scout crafts. Another suggested politely that perhaps the Red Cross had other duties requiring her attention. But Morrison studied the compass with different eyes. He had lost 32 men under his command to navigation failures in 6 weeks. He had written letters to mothers explaining that their sons died lost in a forest, which felt more shameful than dying in combat. He picked up the compass, watching the needle settle with unwavering precision despite the iron stove burning 6 feet away. A stove that made every military compass in the tent spin uselessly. Major Chen, Morrison said quietly, prepare a test protocol. Miss Hayes, you have 72 hours to build 3 more of these compasses. Then we run field tests. If your equipment works, we'll talk about production. If it fails, it won't fail, Margaret interrupted. But you need to understand something. This isn't mass production equipment. Each compass requires hand calibration specific to this region's magnetic profile. I can train others to build them, but it takes time, precision, and materials your supply chain isn't designed to provide. Then we'll find the materials, Morrison said, making a decision that felt simultaneously desperate and inevitable. Because right now, Miss Hayes, your homemade compass is the best option we have. And that should terrify all of us. The meeting ended with orders issued, materials requisitioned, and skepticism barely suppressed. Margaret left the tent carrying responsibilities no civilian should bear, knowing that 73 men she hadn't met yet would trust their lives to equipment built in a freezing workshop using techniques her father had taught her 20 years ago in Montana wilderness. Outside, snow began falling again. The forest waited, indifferent to American determination or German strategy. Somewhere in those trees, men were already lost, walking in circles, praying for salvation that standard equipment couldn't provide. The war had just given Margaret Hayes 72 hours to prove that innovation born from desperation could save lives that military budgets and established doctrine could not. December 4th, 0600 hours. Margaret worked in a converted supply shed that shook every time artillery fired from positions 3 miles west. Her workshop consisted of a wooden workbench, a kerosene heater that barely functioned, and materials scrounged from sources that would have horrified military procurement officers. Brass fittings from destroyed vehicles, mineral oil from medical supplies, magnetized steel from disassembled field radios, and instrument-grade wood from a church organ damaged during shelling. The temperature inside the shed hovered at 32 degrees. Margaret's fingers, wrapped in cut fingerless gloves, moved with surgical precision despite the cold that made fine motor control nearly impossible. Each compass required 47 separate steps, each step demanding accuracy measured in fractions of millimeters. A single miscalibration would turn life-saving equipment into dangerous liability. "You're using watch parts," Captain Robert Jennings observed, watching Margaret work with visible skepticism. Morrison had assigned him to supervise compass production, which really meant document the inevitable failure. Jennings was 34, West Point graduate, engineer by training, and deeply suspicious of solutions that didn't emerge from proper military channels. "Jeweled bearings," Margaret corrected, not looking up as she carefully placed a pivot point into the brass housing using tweezers designed for watch repair. They provide friction-free rotation necessary for precision. Military compass bearings use ball bearings designed for durability, not accuracy. In magnetically distorted environments, that durability becomes a liability. She worked 16-hour days with breaks only for meals she often forgot to eat. The process was brutally demanding. First, she hand-carved each wooden casing from maple wood that had been dried for decades in that Belgian church, wood with stability characteristics modern materials couldn't match. Then she machined brass housings using hand tools because powered equipment introduced vibrations that compromised calibration. The needles required magnetization using techniques developed by 19th-century surveyors, heating steel to specific temperatures, cooling at controlled rates, exposing to magnetic fields at precise angles. "This should take weeks in a proper laboratory," Jennings said, watching Margaret etch calibration marks using a straight edge and magnifying glass. "You're doing it in a freezing shed with improvised equipment." "The men dying in that forest don't have weeks," Margaret replied. "They have hours, maybe less." The challenges were overwhelming and constant. Brass fittings required grinding to exact tolerances using hand files because machine tools weren't available. Mineral oil needed purification because impurities affected needle movement. The biggest challenge was calibration. Each compass needed adjustment specific to local magnetic anomalies, requiring Margaret to calculate variations using mathematics she performed by lantern light at 200 hours when exhaustion made numbers blur together. Materials shortages created constant emergencies. Proper brass became unavailable after a supply convoy was destroyed, forcing Margaret to use shell casings that required extensive modification. Watch parts came from soldiers voluntarily donating personal timepieces, an act of faith that humbled her every time someone handed over a watch their father or grandfather had carried. Wood supplies ran out, sending her searching through damaged buildings for alternatives, eventually finding a piano in a ruined schoolhouse that provided maple soundboard wood with perfect grain characteristics. Lieutenant Sarah Whitmore, a nurse who had worked with Margaret during civilian evacuations, volunteered to help despite having no technical training. "Tell me what to do," she said, arriving at the workshop at 0700 hours, "and I'll do it." Together, they worked through days that blurred into continuous labor. Sarah learned to prepare brass housings while Margaret calibrated needles. They developed assembly line efficiency despite having only 2 sets of hands and equipment that belonged in a museum. When kerosene for the heater ran out, they worked in gloves and coats, watching their breath fog in the air as they built precision instruments under conditions that defied every principle of proper manufacturing. "How did you learn this?" Sarah asked during a rare break, both women drinking coffee that tasted like mud but provided essential warmth. "My father," Margaret said, her Montana accent stronger when she was exhausted. "He surveyed railroad routes through territory where magnetic compasses failed. Iron ore deposits, volcanic rock, mineral formations that made navigation impossible. He taught me techniques surveyors developed in the 1800s because sometimes old solutions work better than modern ones." Testing created new challenges. Initial field tests showed compass accuracy, but soldiers reported difficulty reading calibrations in low light. Margaret redesigned markings using luminescent paint salvaged from aircraft instruments. The wooden casings, while technically superior, proved vulnerable to moisture, forcing her to develop waterproofing using beeswax and linseed oil. Each problem solved revealed 3 more problems requiring solutions. Captain Jennings's skepticism slowly transformed into something closer to awe. "You're reverse engineering 19th century precision instruments using 20th century salvage," he said, watching Margaret calibrate a compass by comparing it against star positions visible through the shed's single window. "This shouldn't work. By every engineering principle I know, this should be impossible. Engineering principles assume proper facilities, adequate materials, and sufficient time," Margaret replied, not looking up from her calibration calculations. "We have none of those, so we adapt." By December 6th, she had completed 6 functional compasses, each one tested and retested until her eyes burned from squinting at calibration marks by lantern light. Her hands showed cuts from brass filings, burns from magnetization processes, and the deep fatigue of someone who had pushed human capability to its absolute limit. But the compasses worked. Field tests proved accuracy within 2 degrees across all terrain, performance that exceeded military-grade equipment under these specific conditions. Morrison approved full deployment, which meant Margaret now faced a different problem. She needed to build 20 more compasses in 5 days and train others to manufacture them because one woman working alone couldn't possibly meet demand. Outside the shed, the forest continued consuming American lives. Each compass Margaret built might save 12 men, which meant every hour mattered. She returned to work despite exhaustion that made her hands shake, despite cold that made concentration nearly impossible, because somewhere in those trees, soldiers were depending on equipment that didn't exist yet. The workshop door opened. Major Chen entered, carrying a wooden crate. "Officers donated these," he said, setting the crate on the workbench. Inside, 17 wristwatches, a pocket watch that looked like a family heirloom, and a note that read, "For Margaret's compasses, bring our boys home." Margaret looked at those watches, each one a personal sacrifice, each one representing faith in her ability, and felt the crushing weight of responsibility that comes when human lives depend entirely on your skill and determination. "I'll bring them home," she said quietly, picking up her tools, "or die trying." December 12th, 1944, 15:30 hours. Oberst Hans Richter studied reconnaissance reports in his command bunker 12 miles inside what German forces considered secure territory. A veteran of campaigns from Poland to Stalingrad, Richter prided himself on understanding American tactical patterns, but the reports in front of him defied every pattern he had identified over 3 years of combat. "They're moving through the forest," his intelligence officer said, pointing at a map marked with red indicators showing American patrol routes. "Not around it, through it. Areas where their own forces previously avoided, they now cross with precision. Supply convoys reach destinations despite jamming. Evacuation teams extract wounded from coordinates they shouldn't be able to find." Richter lit a cigarette, studying the map with growing unease. German strategy in the Ardennes had specifically exploited American navigation failures. The forest's magnetic anomalies were well documented in German military intelligence. Comprehensive surveys had mapped every iron deposit, every magnetic distortion. German forces used pre-plotted routes marked with physical waypoints, buried magnets, concealed markers, systems that required extensive preparation but provided reliable navigation. American forces had no such preparation time. They should be navigationally blind, dependent on equipment that couldn't function. For 6 weeks, that blindness had been Germany's tactical advantage. Now, somehow, Americans were moving through the forest with confidence that suggested they had solved a problem German engineers considered unsolvable without months of survey work. "Propaganda," Richter's executive officer suggested. "They want us to believe they have capabilities they lack." But the evidence was undeniable. On December 8th, an American patrol had crossed 11 miles of forest at night in fog, arriving at German positions with accuracy that allowed perfectly coordinated flanking maneuver. On December 10th, supply convoy had navigated through terrain, German intelligence rated impassable without pre-positioned navigation aids, delivering ammunition to forward positions that should have been unreachable. On December 11th, American rescue team had located and evacuated a crashed bomber crew from coordinates that German search parties with superior equipment had failed to find. "They have new equipment," Richter said slowly, feeling the cold certainty of tactical advantage slipping away. "Something we haven't identified, something that works in conditions where conventional compasses fail." German intelligence redoubled efforts. Captured equipment revealed nothing unusual. American soldiers still carried standard-issue compasses. Interrogations proved frustrating because American soldiers either genuinely didn't know about new navigation equipment or had been instructed to reveal nothing. Radio intercepts provided no insights. Whatever technology Americans had developed, they were guarding it with operational security that approached paranoia. On December 14th, German patrol encountered an American unit deep in the forest and captured them after brief firefight. Among the captured equipment, a compass that looked nothing like standard military issue. It was wooden, civilian-looking, handcrafted with obvious improvisation. German intelligence officer examined it with visible confusion. "It's junk," he reported to Richter. "Homemade equipment, probably personal item from one of the soldiers. It can't possibly function better than our calibrated instruments." But when they tested it against German military compasses in the forest, the results were undeniable. The American homemade compass provided accurate directional readings, while German equipment spun uselessly. German engineers disassembled it, finding watch parts, mineral oil, magnetization techniques they recognized from pre-industrial surveying methods, and calibration so precise it shouldn't be achievable outside laboratory conditions. "This is improvisation," the engineer reported, his voice carrying undertones of professional disbelief. "Someone built this by hand, using materials salvaged from various sources, employing methods we abandoned 50 years ago because they're too labor-intensive. It shouldn't work this well. By modern engineering standards, it's primitive, but in these specific conditions, it's superior to anything we have." Richter absorbed this information with the sick realization of strategic implications. German doctrine emphasized technological superiority, industrial precision, systematic preparation. The idea that Americans could achieve tactical advantage through improvisation, through crude, handmade equipment built with techniques that predated modern manufacturing, contradicted every assumption German military planning had made about American capabilities. "They're not using advanced technology," Richter said slowly, the implications settling over him like cold rain. "They're using appropriate technology. They adapted to conditions we thought were adaptation-proof. While we deployed jamming equipment and relied on our pre-positioned markers, they invented a solution we never anticipated because we assumed the problem required sophisticated approaches." The philosophical difference revealed deeper truth about how each nation approached warfare. German strategy demanded perfection, precision, systematic implementation of doctrine developed in peacetime. American strategy, Richter was learning, embraced improvisation, pragmatic solutions, willingness to abandon doctrine entirely if field conditions demanded it. Germans planned for every contingency. Americans invented new contingencies. "Can we replicate this compass?" Richter asked the engineer. "Technically, yes, but each compass requires hand calibration specific to local magnetic variations. Production would be labor-intensive, time-consuming, and impossible to scale through our manufacturing systems. The Americans have something we lack, someone with expertise in pre-industrial navigation techniques, combined with willingness to implement those techniques, despite them being inefficient by modern standards." On December 15th, American forces launched coordinated operations using forest routes German intelligence had classified as navigationally impossible. The attacks came from unexpected directions, with precision that suggested Americans now understood forest navigation better than German forces who had occupied the territory for months. Richter's defensive positions, carefully planned to exploit American navigation limitations, became suddenly vulnerable. "How many of these compasses do they have?" Richter's executive officer asked, studying after-action reports that showed American operational patterns changing with alarming speed. "Enough," Richter replied grimly, "and they're building more." Someone on their side understood that winning this forest didn't require better technology. It required different technology. While we invested in sophisticated jamming equipment and pre-positioned navigation systems, they invested in knowledge our military academies don't teach anymore because we consider it obsolete. Idku, the first engagement where Americans used their navigation advantage to devastating effect, occurred on December 17th. German patrol, confident in their security because they were positioned deep in navigable only to German forces territory, was surrounded by American forces who had approached from directions Germans hadn't bothered defending. The battle was brief and conclusive. Germans surrendered, their commander asking a question that summed up their confusion. "How did you find us?" The American lieutenant, compass hanging from his uniform, smiled. "Lady in a workshop built us something better than what you've got." That answer traveled through prisoner interrogation networks, reaching Richter 3 days later. He read the report and understood finally that his assumptions about American military capability had been fundamentally flawed. He had underestimated not their technology, but their adaptability, not their industrial capacity, but their willingness to embrace solutions that military doctrine considered beneath consideration. "Issue revised tactical guidance," Richter ordered. "Assume American forces have full navigation capability throughout the forest. All defensive positions must be reinforced accordingly, and find out who this lady in a workshop is. She may have just changed how this entire campaign unfolds." February 15th, 1945. The workshop was warmer now, the kerosene heater finally working properly. Margaret Hayes sat at her workbench, training the 7th person to build compasses, using techniques that had saved 73 American lives during the Battle of the Bulge, and hundreds more in operations that followed. The number 73 had become legendary. On December 19, 1944, during the height of German offensive, Lieutenant Morrison had led a patrol, using Margaret's compasses, to guide 73 surrounded American soldiers through 16 miles of German-controlled forest to safety. Every man had survived. The mission, impossible by conventional assessment, succeeded because improvised navigation equipment functioned where military-grade technology failed. "The needle needs to settle within 2 seconds, Margaret explained to her student, a young corporal from Wisconsin named James Peterson, who had mechanical aptitude and patience necessary for precision work. "If it takes longer, the pivot point needs adjustment. Here, let me show you." Statistical impact told the story conventional military reports couldn't capture. Between December 8th and January 31st, American forces equipped with Margaret's compasses completed 147 forest operations with a 94% success rate, compared to 38% success rate for operations using standard equipment. Navigation-related casualties dropped by 76%. Supply delivery reliability increased by 63%. Enemy positions thought unreachable became accessible, turning German defensive advantages into vulnerabilities. But numbers couldn't quantify human impact. Margaret kept letters written by soldiers who had survived missions they thought impossible, mothers who thanked her for bringing sons home, commanders who credited her compasses with saving operations that otherwise would have failed catastrophically. She read those letters at night when self-doubt crept in, when the weight of responsibility felt crushing, when she wondered if one civilian woman really could have changed military outcomes through determination and improvised equipment. "Miss Hayes," Colonel Morrison said, entering the workshop carrying official documentation that made Margaret's stomach tighten. "The Army wants to award you the Medal of Freedom. There will be a ceremony, recognition, publicity, No, Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. Absolutely not. Morrison's expression showed he had expected this response. These men owe you their lives. The country should know what you accomplished. The men know, Margaret said, gesturing at the letters covering one wall of the workshop. Their families know. That's enough. The moment this becomes public, it becomes about me instead of about what mattered. We adapted, we improvised, we solved a problem everyone said was unsolvable. That lesson is more important than any individual recognition. The compass's influence extended beyond immediate tactical applications. Margaret's techniques sparked broader conversations about military procurement, innovation during crisis, value of knowledge that couldn't be mass-produced or systematized. Her workshop became unofficial training ground, where engineers learned navigation principles military academies hadn't taught in decades. 7 soldiers requested transfer to work with her, learning skills they planned to carry into civilian life after the war. Captain Jennings, the skeptical West Point engineer who had initially dismissed her work, wrote a technical report analyzing the compass's design principles. His report, classified but influential, challenged fundamental assumptions about military equipment development. Specialist Hayes demonstrated that technological sophistication is not equivalent to operational effectiveness. In specific operational environments, older methodologies implemented with precision outperform modern systems designed for general application. Military procurement should prioritize adaptive capability over standardization. The broader implications rippled through military planning. If navigation problems could be solved through improvisation rather than industrial production, what other challenges might benefit from creative approaches that doctrine discouraged? Margaret's success emboldened other unconventional thinkers. A mechanic who redesigned fuel systems using techniques from agricultural equipment, a radio operator who improved communication using crystal radio principles from the 1920s, a medic who adapted civilian first aid innovations that military medical doctrine hadn't incorporated. You started something, Major Chen told Margaret one evening as they watched soldiers practice navigation techniques in the workshop. People are questioning assumptions, asking whether established procedures are actually optimal or just established. That's dangerous thinking for military bureaucracy, but it's exactly what wins wars. As Germany collapsed and victory became inevitable, Margaret began planning her post-war life. She would return to Montana, to quiet landscapes where her father had taught her to find true north by stars and instinct. She would teach, perhaps passing knowledge to new generations. She would certainly never tell her own story. The 73 soldiers would tell it for her, and that was enough. On April 12, 1945, a package arrived from Lieutenant Morrison. Inside, a compass, the first one she had built, returned by the officer who had carried it through the Battle of the Bulge. A note accompanied it. This belongs in a museum, but museums can wait. You should keep it. 73 men lived because you built this. Their children will grow up because you refused to accept that the impossible was actually impossible. History will remember the battles, but we'll remember you. Margaret held that compass, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the freezing workshop, the impossible deadlines, the determination that comes when human lives depend entirely on your skill. She thought about the men who had survived, the families that remained whole, the difference one person could make when expertise met desperation and produced innovation. The official military records would note, navigation improvements in the Ardennes sector significantly impacted operational effectiveness. Historians would write about equipment modifications and tactical adaptations. But the soldiers would tell a different story, truer and more human, about a woman from Montana who built compasses in a freezing workshop, who proved that sometimes the best technology is no technology at all, just knowledge, precision, and stubborn refusal to accept death as inevitable. Years later, when military historians finally declassified operation reports and Margaret's role became public knowledge, A researcher asked her how she had felt knowing 73 lives depended on equipment she built by hand. Margaret thought about that freezing workshop, about hands shaking from cold while calibrating instruments that needed precision measured in fractions of degrees, about the crushing responsibility and the determination that comes when people you've never met trust you completely. I felt terrified, she said honestly, but more than that, I felt American. We don't accept impossible. We find another way. My father taught me navigation in Montana wilderness. Those soldiers taught me courage in Belgian forests. Together, we proved something important. The human capacity to adapt and overcome is our greatest weapon. Not technology, not doctrine, just determination, creativity, and refusal to quit when lives are at stake. The compasses themselves, artifacts of improvisation and desperate innovation, eventually found their way to military museums where they sat in glass cases with plaques explaining their significance. But the real legacy wasn't physical, it was philosophical. Margaret Hayes had demonstrated that war isn't won only by nations with biggest factories or most sophisticated technology, but by nations willing to embrace unconventional solutions when conventional approaches fail. 73 soldiers lived because one woman refused to accept that expertise, determination, and improvised equipment couldn't solve problems that defeated standardized systems. Their survival became testament to American innovation at its finest: practical, pragmatic, creative, and utterly unwilling to let doctrine override what actually worked. The war ended, soldiers went home, Margaret returned to Montana, but in workshops, training facilities, and military academies, her lesson endured. Sometimes saving lives requires not better technology, but different thinking. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is a homemade compass built by someone who understood that true north isn't found on any map. It's found in the determination to bring everyone home safely, no matter how impossible that seems. If this story of American ingenuity and determination moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible untold stories of World War II. Drop a comment below. What other unsung heroes of the war should we cover next? Your suggestions help us bring these forgotten stories back to life. Thank you for watching, and remember, history's greatest victories often came from the most unexpected heroes.